Morning. Dr. Mavity Madalena was in touch with me on Saturday, asking what I thought I might spend some time on during today's chapel talk. I'm out of money for Chipotle events and have no school holidays to give during this final week of classes prior to Thanksgiving break, the most important break in our school year, in my opinion. So I responded by saying that I would probably lean into a talk about Thanksgiving, about all that I am thankful for. Now in my 8th year as head of school at Brooks, my pattern has been to talk with Thanksgiving in mind at this time of year, or to speak about Veterans Day if I find myself scheduled to talk on or near the day itself. I'd also thought I might talk about meeting my wife right here at Brooks School, given that we will celebrate our 20th wedding anniversary in just 9 days. It's a really, really good story if you haven't heard it. And there isn't anything that I'm more thankful for than my wife and children. Yet as the weekend wore on, I found myself thinking mostly about our school. As a preface of sorts, I would offer that what I have in mind are just my imperfect thoughts, some feelings, some opinions, and I suppose I hope that all of it contributes constructively to conversations of all sorts and sizes. I hope we will stay in about our school. In my first 6 years on the faculty at Brooks, from 1990 to 1996, I pursued a master's degree over the summers at Wesleyan University in Middletown, Connecticut. In that I was a history teacher in those years, I concentrated my course of study in social studies and took a range of courses that I loved. My work at Wesleyan culminated with my master's thesis, written about President Lyndon Johnson's war on poverty in the 1960s. I was moved in that direction of that particular thesis and topic by a professor I had in 2 separate courses at Wesleyan. One of those courses was titled The Struggle for Equality, 1954 to 1990, and the other was titled American Culture and History, 1950 to 1970. The combination of these 2 courses raised a lot for me in those years, more than I can share in just one talk. But I'd like to focus on 2 experiences I had in those courses that have remained in mind since. I think they'll remain in mind and somewhat unresolved for the rest of my life. In the Struggle for Equality, 1954 to 1990 class, we read a book titled Faces at the Bottom of the Well, The Permanence of Racism, written by Derek Bell and published in 1992. Among other things, Mr. Bell was a civil rights lawyer earlier in his life, and then went on to be the first tenured African-American professor of law at Harvard Law School. He taught later at New York University School of Law and was the dean of the University of Oregon School of Law. He passed away 4 years ago. The book itself is essentially a series of fictional stories or fables, and the most provocative is the final chapter titled The Space Traders. A New York Times review of Mr. Bell's book described that chapter in this way, and I quote, "One of the most effective fables, and by far the most chilling, is the tale of the space traders, creatures from another planet who offer the United States the solution to all its economic and environmental ills in exchange for one thing, its black population, which would be carried off to an unknown fate in outer space. The story becomes a canvas for Mr. Bell's portraits of the wise, foolish, weak, strong, and venal characters of both races who respond to this challenge to the national soul. That the outcome is predictable makes it no less heartbreaking, end quote. The outcome the New York Times piece referenced was that the question is ultimately put to a national vote in this fable and passes with a considerable majority supporting the trade. While fiction, of course, I used to have my U.S. history classes read and discuss the fable. Did we think that the United States would make this trade if it were ever presented? What did we think about Mr. Bell's claim that racism is permanent? My classes never thought the trade would be made, and I didn't either. And we always debated the notion of racism as permanent without a clear consensus. Yet Derek Bell's question, his feeling that the American population would vote to make that trade, stuck with me. It still does. Now, I'm far from a Derek Bell expert, read nothing of his other than this book. And yet this idea that racism could not be eradicated ran counter to my instincts. This didn't seem to fit with Dr. King's words and aspirations as I understood and appreciated them. I disagreed with Mr. Bell. I felt in my heart that good people, well-meaning people who care about equity and justice and fairness, of which I counted myself as one, could find a way to wipe racism from the earth. At a minimum, I thought I could and wanted to be part of a community in my life that raised the bar and expected more from one another. I think our school is such a place, actually. Imperfect, to be sure. In process, most definitely. But growing and trying to do a better job all the time when it comes to equity and inclusivity and appreciating difference. I want us to be a school that can accommodate both agreement and disagreement with Mr. Bell's notion about the permanence of racism. One, that Mr. Bell is wrong, and that a route to a world without racism is a worthy pursuit, the right pursuit, an attainable pursuit. Or that Mr. Bell is right, and that racism is here to stay, and that we account for that reality by confronting it differently, not as something we'll eliminate, but as something we abhor, name as such, and stare down routinely. This brings me to President Johnson and my attraction to him as a figure I wanted to know more about. I believe one would have a hard time making a case for a president other than Lincoln who has pushed harder and achieved more legislative triumph on behalf of the marginalized in the United States than he did, many of whom were African American. The war on poverty, which I focused on in my thesis, was not an unconditional success. Poverty endures. Yet poverty rates dropped by nearly 40%. The program Head Start was born in 1965 and found its way to serving 400,000 children shortly after its inception. The Civil Rights Act of 1964 aimed to make good on the Constitution's commitment to equal rights under the law. The Voting Rights Act of 1965 transformed voter registration numbers amongst African Americans in the South in just 1 year's time. This was watershed legislation by any measure. Yet in the same summer of 1965, during the same month that the Voting Rights Act became law, Watts County, a predominantly African American community in Los Angeles, erupted into violence. This trend continued in cities across the country in 1966 and 1967. It broke Johnson in many ways. It devastated him. And along with our failure in Vietnam, led him to not run for re-election in 1968. I found that so sad, unfair even, and have come to believe that my sadness about President Johnson's ultimate defeat had something to do with where I felt limited in my own life. He tried so hard, I thought, and undeniable progress was made, yet hundreds of thousands remained unsatisfied, to the point of rioting even. What more could he have done, I wondered. What more can I do, I sometimes wonder. I know that I enjoy the privilege of never having needed the War on Poverty, or Head Start, or what the Civil Rights Act of 1964 aimed to ensure, or what the Voting Rights Act of 1965 aimed to make accessible, because I grew up and have lived with what all of those measures aimed to address. I have not wanted for much of anything in my life, and have enjoyed extraordinary privileges and advantages, more now than ever before. It is easy for me to assess progress that has been made, note it as such, and not ever have to deal with the imperfections of the legislation, or where it came up short of delivering what it intended to deliver. It has never affected me. What an incredible privilege that is. What I have come to believe, with far more time to evolve than any of you have, is that how people feel matters most to me. And why wouldn't we be engaged in trying to move in a direction that better understands the feelings of others? I have also come to believe that we do our best work with one another when we suspend judgment and listen intently. Listen in a way that Ms. Chaniel and Mr. Konovalchik called on different audiences to do in emails each sent over the weekend, empathically. After grappling with the horror of the brutal and senseless attacks on innocent people in Paris on Friday night, I found my way to asking myself, why would anyone act in this way? What could possibly drive individuals to murder in such calculated and callous ways? The answers to these questions are complex, to be sure, but at least a small part of the answer must center on ISIS having a total absence of empathy, a frightening certainty about its purpose, and zero interest in hearing any other point of view. As a result, there is no ability for ISIS to be a citizen of any world community. Impossible. So as we talk amongst ourselves in different configurations about our school, it matters to me that we do so by really listening to one another, by really caring for one another, that we work hard to ensure that others observe us to be listening and caring, that we engage with one another in a mindset aimed at improving our school, that we lean into discomfort at times, that we think about our point of view as ours, as opposed to the right one, that we do so aiming to be exceptional citizens of this community, because practicing this here will position you to lead and make a difference throughout your lives in communities you will someday be a part of. I have a lot to be thankful for, with just 10 days to go until Thanksgiving. Our school and the time and opportunity we have to live and learn together is at the head of my list. In that spirit, let's finish the fall well, enjoy the break, and have a great start to the winter upon our return. Take good care. Thank you.